Welcome to History and Politics with Dr. Brovkin. Today, my dear friends, the 23rd of July 2026, I'd like to discuss one question. Is Russia really losing the war? Or to rephrase it, why is Russia winning the war? This has been debated lately in many mass media, in serious journals, and specialists and observers of Russian affairs, and the standard interpretation that I hear in the last few weeks is that Russia is not doing very well. In fact, the Western media is full of praises to Ukraine, that it supposedly has delivered a number of crushing blows to Ukraine with its drone warfare. And the current crisis in Ukraine over the fate of Fyodorov, the author of the drone warfare, is a lot of times not related to whether Ukraine is losing or whether it is winning. It is somehow presented as a domestic dispute between leaders of Ukraine that should be overcome as quickly as possible so that Ukraine can concentrate one more time on its winning streak against Russia. So let me first present to you the arguments of those that are arguing that Ukraine is winning and by contrast Russia is losing. And then I want to answer those arguments one by one in presenting my own argument. So among those very prominent people who have presented this a thesis that Russia is losing is Gilbert Doctorow, a respected analyst of Russian affairs, and he published an article, Russia is Losing the War, in Substack, and then in his interview with Glenn Deason, a very quite well-known observer of Russian scene that has an interesting show on YouTube. So the arguments are quite simple. Drone warfare. Because of drone warfare, argues Doctorow, 10,000 drone operators can hold on the offensive of hundreds of thousands of Russian troops in Ukraine. An offensive became impossible because of the drone saturation. And that is something that is changing the dynamics of the war, according to this argument. And then there's endless of examples or evidence provided that destruction of the interior is possible and is quite real. Russia has no electricity in some parts of Crimea, no transport functioning corridor to Crimea. And then Doctorow cites the governor of Kherson province, who said that the frontline areas are uninhabitable. All that is supposedly the evidence that Russia is losing the war. The oil refineries are burning. Russia had to buy oil and gasoline from world market, from various countries, and most importantly, the conclusion of these realities is that the goals of the special military operation are not reached and cannot be reached. From here follows, if they cannot be reached, Russia cannot win. If it cannot win, the logic suggests it lost. Now, that's the logic of this argument. As you could see, obviously, the entire argument is based on the assumption that the drone warfare is effective and there's no countermeasures, and Russia doesn't have any countermeasures to overcome this drone warfare. It also, the logic is somewhat crooked in a sense that yes, even if there's tremendous devastation by the drone warfare, it still does not translate into a victory over Russia. Or, in other words, Russia or any country can sustain very serious damage because of drone and still win the war. Well, the case in point is Vietnam. Vietnam was flattened by American bombing, and yet it did not lose. It won against the United States by making the continuation of the war too costly and impossible for a variety of military and political reasons. And yet, nevertheless, so let me turn to the counter argument. The best example of counter argument is that yesterday, the 22nd of July, 400 Ukrainian drones attacked Moscow region. Not one of them reached Moscow. Not one. They were all intercepted. And the official news is that one person was killed. It was a child, and his two parents were wounded when the debris of a shot down drone fell on a private house in a village in the Moscow province. And then there were two other people wounded from a fire that was ignited by the debris of the falling drone. So this example shows that the Russians have learned how to counteract a massive drone attack on an area that is heavily protected. However, some other areas are not as heavily protected, so that means that the Russians are working on that now. They're trying to expand the drone and countermeasures to as large territory as possible, especially in the areas and oblast regions on the border with Ukraine. Now, speaking of drones, the Ukrainians have actually two types of drones, and it's very important to distinguish those in terms of what they can do. The large number of drones are manufactured in Ukraine, and they are small handheld drones that are either of a helicopter type or of a small airplane type. Now, these are very light. They're handheld, even the airplane types, and they cannot do much damage because the explosive charge is quite small. What they can do, and what they have been doing quite successfully, is igniting fires in storage facilities, because these are highly flammable material, and even a small grenade is enough to set an oil facility on fire. Now, this is, of course, produces excellent photo opportunities, but this does not translate into long-lasting damage to Russia. Yes, this temporary disruption of oil, no more than that. And I already mentioned in my previous shows that Russia is the second largest producer of oil in the world, and knocking out here and there a refinery can only be a matter of temporary dislocation that can be and is overcome as I speak in the last few days. Now, the second part of Ukrainian drones are those that are quite sophisticated. Some of them even have artificial intelligence, and they are made in Europe. The Ministry of Defense of Russia published a list of factories that produce them in Denmark, in Germany, in France, in the United Kingdom, and they are the ones that can fly several hundred kilometers, and they are the ones that have been driven against Moscow targets. Now, and again, as I said, the Russians have developed, and they're not telling exactly what these anti-measures are. Is it radio suppression? Is it laser? This is a military secret, and they're not in a hurry to reveal, but the result is that of the 400 drones, none, zero, none of them penetrated the skies of Moscow city. Now, by contrast, the Russians themselves have been the pioneers of developing very, very effective drones. These are called Geraň 4. These are turbo rather than propeller reactive engines. They are fast. They go into distance of several hundred kilometers, and they are, as the specialists say, undetectable. They cannot be detected at all, and that makes them extremely effective. Also, one of the new measures that the Russians have launched in the last several weeks is the Rassvet satellite system, which makes the guiding of Russian ballistic missiles and hypersonic missiles much, much more effective, now covering the entire territory of Ukraine, which was not the case just a couple of months ago. So, the goals of the special military operation. The Doctorow and his supporters and others argue they cannot be reached because of the stalemate at the front. But the front is not in a stalemate, it is moving. Moreover, it is not only the movement of the front, but also the newest campaign of the Russian offensive in the air that makes profound, maybe crucial difference. Because if the Ukrainians are using light drones, heavy drones, and are doing superfluous damage to Russian industry, what the Russians are doing is a total devastation by hundreds, if not thousands times more effective and more devastating. The list of hits that the Russians have been doing is all published at the Ministry of Defense, and therefore I am not going to read you all the factories and plants that the Russians hit. But suffice it to say that in the last week there were at least two, and in the month of July, 4 serious, devastating attacks on Kiev, and all of them military infrastructure. So the Russians have been consistently dismantling any capacity of Ukraine to have any industrial output that can be used to wage a war. That is by far more important fact than any drone offensive that Mr. Fyodorov had initiated. You also, I'm sure, heard that in the last 2 days, the Russians had devastating attacks on the port infrastructure in the Black Sea, in Odessa, Yuzhny, Nikolaev, and other ports, and attacking even a Turkish ship, and making it certain and announcing so that no ships of any kind would be allowed to enter or leave Ukrainian ports. So that makes it possible to significantly reduce the number of drones or any other war material that is being shipped to Ukraine from Europe. In addition to that, the Russians have been systematically destroying gas stations on Ukrainian territories, especially provinces bordering the front line. I think the latest count was 250, and they have been blowing up locomotives and rail junctions, trying to slow down, if not shutting down, the rail traffic between European Union and Ukraine. So that fact, this is a fact. This is what the Russians have been doing, not any kind of interpretation. That fact, I think, answers the question that many have raised in the Western media, those who are professional observers of Russian Sea. The question, will the Russians attack NATO as a measure of deterrence? My answer to this question, no. Russia will not attack NATO for a variety of reasons, but at this point, there is no need to. If Russia can block Ukraine from any deliveries of war material by land and by sea and by air, then all these drones, no matter how many they produce them in Germany, would stay in Germany. So at this point, there is no need to expand the war by risking official entry into war of third countries, when the goals of the depriving Ukraine of these imported machines and weaponry can be reached by other means. So my interpretation that Russian firepower, the capacity to degrade Ukrainian industry is the key to victory, not drones terrorizing local population and igniting oil. Now, the Russian war goals or war aims. Today, Mr. Peskov has announced that they officially have not changed. This is still 4 provinces plus Crimea, plus neutralization of Ukraine, plus limits on its armed forces, plus denazification, which means banning nationalist neo-Nazi formation. And theoretically, that is still possible. Rubio again started talking today about finding peace solution and invigorating search for peace, blah, blah, blah. However, this is the key point. All this is possible. And I think Putin would agree to stop the war tomorrow if these 4 provinces plus is accepted and signed. Only the condition, and the condition is all sanctions against Russia are lifted. 300 billion stolen money returned to Russia. And the war crimes of Ukrainian neo-Nazis is investigated and the guilty ones are tried. And of course, the Pact of Neutrality is signed not just by Ukraine and the United States, not just postponing membership on NATO, but a treaty. Now, if all of that were to be achieved, I believe that Putin would sign such a peace agreement. However, given the mood in the European Union capitals, given the mood in Kiev, given the willingness to waste another 90 billion into the losing cause of Ukrainian war, none of that seems to be plausible, which means that the Russian offensive is going to continue. And the question is not if Russia is going to win, but the question is when it is going to win and what would be the contours of history. Which borders would be Russia's new borders? What regime and in which borders would remain in Ukraine if any of it remains not under Russian control? These are the issues on the agenda, not whether Russia is losing. Thank you. Now, I want to remind you, please, that I have a audio track which is it could be had on Spotify and rsn.com if you prefer to listen. I have other playlists that I invite you to consider by opening up the community tab in my YouTube channel. And of course, I invite you to read my book, From Vladimir Lenin to Vladimir Putin, Russia in Search of Its Identity. Thank you, and I'll see you shortly. Goodbye.